Welcome to the deep dive where we really try to cut through the noise and get straight to the insights. Today we're digging into a series of pretty significant executive orders, or EOs, that President Trump issued shortly after his inauguration back on January 20th, 2025.
Yeah, and our main source for this deep dive is drawn from excerpts of a report by the National Low Income Housing Coalition. It's titled, President Trump Issues Dozens of Executive Orders Impacting Immigrants, Access to Assistance, Federal Workforce, and More. Seems pretty comprehensive. So our mission here today is really to pull out the key nuggets of information, the insights from these sources. We want to help you understand the potential scope, the implications of these actions across some really crucial areas. We're talking about some surprising details, things that could genuinely reshape policies you might interact with. So yeah, what does this actually mean for you? Okay, let's unpack this. Let's maybe start with immigration. The source describes what it calls a truly sweeping executive order there. Can you walk us through what the core directives are?
Absolutely. And sweeping feels like the right word. What's significant is how broadly this EO aims to change things up, both federally and at the state level.
Yep.
It tells federal agencies basically take action to remove undocumented immigrants.
Okay.
And maybe even more notably, it directs states to create these statewide Homeland Security task forces.
Task forces, state level.
Yes, state level. And also to establish detention centers for undocumented immigrants.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, these aren't just small tweaks. It feels like a pretty fundamental shift in the whole enforcement approach.
And there was one detail that really jumped out at me reading the source, this threat to block federal funding from sanctuary cities.
Hmm.
Just for clarity, the source says these are local governments that, limit or deny cooperating with federal immigration enforcement.
Hmm.
How big a deal is that specific part? I mean, what kind of challenges could that create?
Well, it's critical because it's essentially trying to use the power of the purse, federal funding, to make local areas fall in line with federal immigration priorities.
Right.
And, while the EO does say agencies need to ensure undocumented immigrants don't get federal benefits, it's important to remember, as the source points out, under current law, they're already mostly ineligible for things like housing aid, Medicaid, Social Security, SNAP.
Okay, so that's already the case.
Exactly. So this threat to sanctuary cities, it's really aimed at pushing state and local cooperation. It could spark, major legal fights, practical battles over federalism, local control, and it could really impact how cities fund basic services if they decide not to comply.
So if those direct federal benefits are largely restricted already for undocumented individuals, where does this EO hit hardest most immediately? Is it hitting these mixed status families where, maybe one person's undocumented but others aren't?
That's exactly where the source suggests the most direct impact lies.
Yeah.
It points back to a proposed rule from the previous Trump term. That rule would have essentially evicted families from HUD housing assistance if even one member was undocumented.
Evicted. Even if others are citizens or have legal status?
Well, currently, these mixed status families get what's called prorated assistance. So the source gives an example. Say a family of 4, one person's undocumented, they'd get help calculated for a family of 3.
Okay, got it.
This proposed change gets rid of that proration. It's not just about money, it really hits housing stability. It could force families into impossible choices, stay together, or keep their housing support.
That's a tough spot.
Definitely. And the source also mentions the idea of ending birthright citizenship. But it's quick to point out that birthright citizenship is right there in the Constitution. Changing it would mean a constitutional amendment.
Which is a huge hurdle.
A massive legislative lift, exactly. But if you look at the whole picture, the enforcement directives, the detention centers, the sanctuary city pressure, plus the impact on mixed status families, you can see, as the source suggests, a kind of systemic effort to really change daily life for many immigrant families and also affect local government quite deeply.
Okay, so that covers the immigration side. Let's pivot now to how these EOs might be changing the government itself, specifically the federal workforce. What were the key orders impacting federal employees?
Right. So these EOs signal a pretty clear move towards, let's say, tighter control over the federal bureaucracy. Some key directives: ordering federal employees back to the office full-time, no more remote flexibility for many,
Back to the office, okay.
and implementing a hiring freeze across the federal
Or
workforce.
freeze. So no new hires for a while.
Seems like it. These are pretty immediate, broad actions that would affect how basically every agency operates.
And then there's the restoration of something called Schedule F. Now that sounds technical, but the source seemed to think it was really important. What is Schedule F, and why is it such a big deal for federal workers?
It is a big deal. Schedule F is basically a job classification for federal employees that strips away the usual civil service protections.
Protections like what?
Protections against being fired for, say, political reasons or without due process. These were put in place historically to ensure a nonpartisan professional civil service.
Right, keep politics out of the day-to-day government work.
Exactly. So restoring Schedule F, as the source explains it, would make it much, much easier to fire career civil servants. The source mentions insubordination as an example reason. It could potentially undermine the independence and expertise within the federal workforce.
So less job security for potentially thousands of federal workers.
Potentially tens of thousands. It vastly increases the number of employees who could be dismissed more or less at will. That's a huge philosophical shift in federal employment. And there were other EOs too, like removing requirements for pay transparency and equity for federal workers and contractors.
I mean,
And another one, putting a stop to any new federal rules from the previous Biden administration from taking effect. A regulatory freeze, essentially.
and I think the source also mentioned something about White House staff getting top-secret clearances but skipping the usual background checks. Is that right?
That's in there, yes. Skipping the typical, often lengthy vetting process.
What are the implications of that? Seems risky.
Well, the concern raised implicitly is security. Bypassing standard vetting could introduce vulnerabilities. It also raises questions about who gets access to highly sensitive information and why the normal checks aren't deemed necessary. And you have to see this in context. The source brings up existing staffing problems in agencies like HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It cites a 2018 Inspector General report talking about constant turnover and extended vacancies.
Right, so they were already struggling.
Exactly. The report said HUD couldn't fill key jobs with people who stayed long enough to actually implement changes effectively.
Okay.
So you take that existing problem, add a hiring freeze, add the potential instability from Schedule F, maybe less rigorous vetting at the top. It really makes you ask, as the source implies, what does all this mean for how well federal programs and services actually get delivered to you, the public?
That's a really important question. Okay, let's move from the workforce to another area highlighted, an executive order about gender recognition. What did this particular EO declare, and how did the source interpret its purpose?
This EO stated pretty plainly that the administration recognizes only two sexes, male and female. Period.
Just two.
Just two. And the source's interpretation is quite direct. It states the purpose is essentially to manufacture justification for discrimination against transgender people.
So the source sees it as laying groundwork.
Exactly, as a kind of foundational statement to enable other policy changes down the line.
And does the source anticipate what those other changes might be? What are they expecting to see next based on this?
It does. The source anticipates that this initial EO declaration will likely be followed by others, specifically targeting transgender individuals' access to things like shelter, healthcare, other essential resources.
Is there precedent for this? Did the source mention past actions?
Yeah, it connects it back to the previous Trump administration. For instance, HUD, back then, put forward a proposed rule. That rule would have limited transgender people's access to shelter services that affirm their gender identity.
So potentially denying access to shelters based on gender identity.
Essentially, yes. Or forcing them into shelters that don't align with their identity. And the consequences, according to the source, could be really severe. It stated such a policy would worsen the number of transgender people experiencing unsheltered homelessness.
Which is already a crisis.
Right. And that being unsheltered puts them at much higher risk of violence, whether that's on the streets or even within inappropriate shelter settings.
So we're talking about access to basic safety, basic necessities for a population that's already pretty vulnerable.
That's exactly the human impact the source is highlighting here.
Yeah. Okay, so we've covered quite a bit today. We've unpacked these executive orders looking at immigration, major shifts there, then adjustments to the federal workforce, the structure of government work itself, and finally, these issues around gender recognition and access to basic services. So thinking about all this, what does it all mean for you, the listener?
Well, I think if you connect the dots, as the source seems to do, it really underscores how powerful executive actions can be. These aren't just abstract policy debates. They can have really immediate, far-reaching effects on many aspects of society, on individual lives. Understanding the specifics, the details, like we've tried to pull out today, it's pretty crucial because these things can directly influence everything from, your local community services to housing, employment, even personal safety and access to healthcare.
Absolutely. The details really matter, and the speed at which EOs can change things is striking. So perhaps a final thought for you to consider, building on what we've discussed and what the source implies about monitoring these actions. How might the information we've unpacked today shape your understanding of policy's immediate ripple effects? And maybe, what steps could communities even take to adapt, or perhaps respond, when faced with such significant shifts coming from the executive level? Something to definitely mull over. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive today.